I'll answer the question. You want answers?
I think I'm entitled.
You want answers?
I want the truth!
You can't handle the truth!
Welcome back to Thinking Critical. This is Wes, and it's time for one of our first collabs here on the channel. It's time to talk about some recent... there's a recent article. I believe there was, at first, there was an article from Polygon, and then the Hollywood Reporter picked up on it, had their own article, basically talking about how the comic book industry survived the implosion that we kind of thought may be coming in 2020 after the pandemic shutdown and all the things that were happening nationwide, worldwide. And they took some key interesting observations of that, and they put it in the article. And I do want to talk with my good friend El Percherino, the poobah of comics himself. Perch, how you doing?
I'm doing great. It's a new year, and yeah, it's good to talk with you.
Absolutely. So we did discuss this a tiny bit when we were talking about like the biggest news stories of 2020, but I think this is more like a lessons learned, and then we can discuss like the evolution of comic books. What things have changed permanently? What do we think comic books are going to look like as far as the industry moving forward? Now, before we get into all this news, I do want to say, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, subscribe, hit the bell for notifications, give us a thumbs up if you enjoy these videos, and give us a thumbs down if you don't. Either way, we want to hear your thoughts regarding the comic books surviving the implosion. Did they? Do you think that the bubble's about to burst, or do you think, as I do, that the comic book industry's proved to be much more resilient than many of us anticipated? Now, there's a couple of key takeaways in there, Perch. One of them being that if you were a comic shop and you had a robust stock of back issues, you were in much better position to survive the pandemic shutdown and then opening back up than other shops, because a lot of people took the time to start filling in and completing, their collections that they hadn't. Maybe they had some gaps here and there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's interesting because I think the article contradicts itself a little bit as it goes through, but this is the major point, is that if you're a comic shop and you have more than just new comics, and when we say new comics, by and large, they mean the big two. That's who dominates the amount of new comics coming out. In fact, and the article references that later down. If you have a business that has back issues or supplies or merchandise or some other thing besides relying the majority of your revenue relying on new comics, then you are able to weather this shutdown, which makes sense. No new comics were being sold for a period of time. When they came back, they were very slow. There were lots of delays, lots of struggles. And so it makes sense. If you had something else in your business, people pivoted to that and life was okay for you.
Yeah, it's something we've discussed here on the channel and on live streams in the past. You need to diversify your risk. You can't put all your eggs in one basket. Now, some people might say, well, comic books are comic books, but that's not to say, there are new comic books, and then there are collector, vintage comics, in like the high value key issues and things like that. Those are all their own separate markets. And, and it kind of makes sense if you think about the way the pandemic affected, the nation or even the world. Not everyone reacted to the pandemic as far as brick and mortar shutdown, like all the other places. Like Arkansas never shut down. If you had a comic shop in Arkansas, you were still open for business. And if you did not have a robust, decent selection of backstock, you were just going to run through the comics that you had and have nothing left to sell.
Yeah, absolutely. And so it wasn't a one size fits all situation for comic shops, and many comic shops. It did give, I think, a lot of stores an incentive and a little bit of a push to actually start selling things online and be able to fulfill mail orders, which some shops had been resisting. That moved over. So, what is interesting is we know some comic shops went out of business this year, and people are not talking about that. And I think one of the reasons is people just don't want to. They consider that bad news, so they just don't want to talk about it. They don't want to mention it. But we know, for example, we know at least a dozen comic shops closed in December. We know this from various news reports and things coming out outside of comics that these businesses have shuttered. And so, comic shops, some comic shops have closed. The customers from those shops have gone to other shops, which has increased their business. So there has been a shift that's gone on. But overall, and I'm not saying this is healthy. It's certainly not. But some of the shops that were overly reliant on new comics and also had resisted any kind of modernization of their business probably were the ones who suffered the most. Then in that case, they had to be living in a state where there wasn't a shutdown.
Absolutely. So you mentioned, a couple of things I want to talk about there, but another key one being shops that had opened up to mail order services, had e-commerce sites, were much better equipped to survive the pandemic and just to meet the demand immediately. And the shops that weren't really equipped to do that probably had to start those things. Well, we know, I believe Pele, he owns a shop. He never had to do that, but apparently, he says 80% of his business is back issues. And he was doing, you could call in and you could do like curbside, and you could do like you could schedule up times to go into the shop. So he was doing things a little bit different. But a lot of other shops had to modernize and had to embrace the future, which is e-commerce. And of course, you have to go out there and compete with some of the heavy hitters. Your My Comic shops, your Mile High Comics, who certainly have embraced the online e-commerce site. Even if you're talking about trades and things, you're competing with Amazon and Walmart and stuff like that. But you have to get out there in the market because that's kind of the future.
Yeah, I mean, it's something you had to do, and it's no different from when comic shops, 15, 20 years ago resisted moving to, like having a cash register in some cases. I mean, there's always been this kind of reluctance to move up, and this was one of the cases where it forced people to move up. But so it was an interesting year, I think, in general, about forcing some comic shops up, often forcing some comic shops to look at other things they need to sell in order to stay in business and to attract their customers. Probably forced a couple of people to put a heavy influence on customer service as well, where they couldn't just sit behind a counter, have new comics on the shelf, and kind of ignore customers as they come in. They have to work a little bit more to engage with their audience, and I think that's also been a pretty important thing that's happened.
Yeah, so you did mention, some people were having to, start to embrace e-commerce. We talked about that. We know, I forget his last name. He's been on the channel. His name's Michael. He owned the last 2 comic shops, I believe, in Little Rock, Arkansas. And during the pandemic, he looked at his business and he said, I don't need brick and mortar anymore. It's time to embrace. So I think we're actually going to start seeing a scaling down of the physical comic shops, which makes sense in the market that we're kind of moving towards, but a scaling out, of just the availability to go and get your comic books, by mail, which kind of, does suck. It's enjoyable to get to go into your comic shop and, look at the cover, maybe get a free preview or whatever. But, for me living on an island with no comic book shop, it's kind of been business as normal or business as usual for me. So do you think that's going to drive some customers away, that they're going to have to go out there and find their comics, maybe, get them shipped from one of the bigger retailers, or maybe find a new local shop that maybe is 2 states over?
Yeah, I do. I think part of the community aspect of being able to go in and see the comics and do that. I mean, that's what comics is for a lot of people. So that is going to change things. People who no longer have that hook, it's going to really rely on the material itself. And I think they'll have an interesting effect where you're going to see more strength out of maybe non-traditional big 2 comics in that world as well. You're going to see people who, in some cases, were propped up. Their interest in the big 2 is propped up by the fact that they could go to a comic shop and talk to people about it and kind of get into those storylines and everything else. And now without that, it's going to be a lot more kind of a more global audience, people online from anywhere that they can talk to, and that's going to push more manga, more indies, more kind of other content that people can buy and consume. So I think we are at the midst of seeing this next 15 years of change that happens about every 15 years in comics. There's a sea change, and this year, 2020, was clearly that year, and now we're going to see what comes out this year and next.
Yeah, I do want to apologize. Michael Tierney, he's the comic book owner from Little Rock, Arkansas. Very nice guy. I've had him on the channel a couple times. What's interesting about that, and I'm certain that you've seen it in your comments section. I've certainly seen it in mine. And, I think there's a lot of people, if they miss the community aspect of getting to go to their comic shop and maybe hang out for a couple of hours and talk about nerd stuff, maybe they went in there and dipped their toes into Twitter, realize what an enormous dumpster fire that is. And I think they've come out and they found channels like yours and mine and other great comic book YouTube channels. And I'm seeing it in my comments. It's like its own little community in there where, people aren't even looking to talk to me. They're talking to each other. It's really enjoyable.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I think there is more of that. It's funny because there was this kind of angry, the comics community is important. You have to earn your way into the comics community kind of behavior that goes on at Twitter, where I know a lot of fans were turned off because creators would tell them, you have to behave the right way and perform the right actions in order to be part of this comic community. A lot of people rejected that. And now we're seeing that rather than put up with this kind of weird tiering bully system, people are just going to channels and finding the community they like and chatting. And my comments is largely more healthy than it's been in quite a long time. I think same thing is true for yours.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's like this weird misnomer about the comic book community. Yes, there are some very salty people out there, but even Doc, who's a very salty guy, or even Pele, who's a pretty salty guy, if you go and ask them about comics, they get excited and they tell you what the comics they like are.
If you can get past that part, absolutely. I think a lot of people will quickly get to the part that they love.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So people really do enjoy talking about that. Now, one of the things they also touched on just a little bit was that perhaps, and I do think they're right on this one, that the lack of availability of movies up to now, even though some theaters are opening, not everyone's comfortable going into a movie theater for their entertainment. Of course, you do have Disney Plus and you have Netflix, but I get the feeling that almost all the Netflix original stuff kind of feels the same. It's really, really elongated movies, like 8-hour movies that, there's only so many of those that you can watch. And a lot of the material on Disney Plus are things that you've already seen. It's not new material and things like that. So I think that comic books coming back after 7 weeks, which I thought they would be shut down longer than that. And I think DC played a big part in that, and they deserve they deserve recognition for basically pushing Diamond forward when they open up their own distribution. But having those new comics and that new product out there, kind of kept comic books relevant, whereas movies really haven't been.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. I do think that DC pushing to come back faster is one of those things that is being kind of underrepresented in the coverage. I think if they hadn't been so aggressive to come back, Diamond wouldn't have either. Marvel wouldn't have either. I think the Diamond came racing back because they saw the world slipping away from them, and they would have been out for at least another month or two if DC had not pushed to change that. So they do deserve a lot of credit for that, I think.
No,
it's good.
So, another interesting thing, you said there was a little bit of contradiction in there, and they were speaking about how, this kind of proved that the big two new comics was the lifeblood of the engine, or the fuel that kind of fuel, or the gas that fuels the industry. And I don't think that's the kind of the takeaway that I came away with. My takeaway is what fuels the industry is the passion of the consumers. That even if there's not new product out there, they will go find things that they will enjoy as long as you have them to offer them. And then if you come back online and you offer some big events, obviously DC came out guns blazing, they'll come back for that too. But it doesn't feel like DC and Marvel were the biggest part of that. It feels like it was the retailers and the customers that made it happen.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is where I think the article makes some mistakes. They connect a lot of dots that I think don't deserve to be connected. I mean, it is that Marvel and DC push the industry. In fact, there's a paragraph in here that says, for decades, monthly comics have been the life force of the industry, getting readers to come back into stores again and again. Miller says 2020 has underscored these monthly titles are irreplaceable to the business. And I'm not completely sure that is accurate. In fact, if you looked at the growth, a lot of the growth came from, as we've talked about before, places completely outside of Western comics. Manga is having a absolutely absurd year of growth. It is, they're posting numbers that topple, the industry. There's a couple series in 2020 where the circulation rates for one comic beat everything that DC and Marvel put out combined. It's just insane how they're out there. So I think that there's some misnomers here, and also I think they're making a connection that 100 new issues a week mean people come into the store every week, and then those people buy other things. But I don't think that's the behavior we saw. We saw people starting to buy other things when there were no new comics coming out, and we saw them branching out that way. I don't think it drives from new comics. In fact, again, you talk to store owner after store owner, and they'll tell you that less reliance on the new comics of the week makes a stronger business. So there's just some, and then it gets into kind of some need to do some crowdfunding and some GoFundMe type behavior and other things. And it kind of flips around a little bit where
Yeah, that's the kind of stuff that doesn't really back up the no implosion. Like people are having to go out there and crowdfund and go ask for money just to keep their business afloat. You know, that indicates they did suffer.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, in this article, it talks about in fact, they used the line, the comeback will be bigger than the setback, and everything kind of bounced back, and the new comics were great and everything else. And then they talk about GoFundMes. You don't do GoFundMes when life is great. So I mean, I find that whole thing a little bit ridiculous. I do think that, pushing other crowdfunding, pushing some of these other models is a good idea. It goes back to what we said at the beginning. It's people finding other ways to make money in this market besides just weekly comics. But that's kind of the whole point. People are finding other ways to make money and get comics into the hands of consumers. So to kind of hook this entire article, which it does in the middle and kind of again at the end, around, new weekly comics from Marvel and DC drive the industry, it's a weird takeaway.
My takeaway has been that I think it's been really healthy that they scale down their lines.
Yeah.
Get people excited for the very best that you have to offer. You don't have to water everything down. Go out there and put your best foot forward and give some room for other people to breathe, because, a lot of what they cut out was just crap. Yeah.
I think that DC has certainly seemed to have learned that lesson. In fact, arguably has gone too far. We'll see what the rest of their year looks like. Marvel, I think, still needs to learn that lesson. They're still pumping out way too much filler. And I do think that 2021 is going to teach a pretty clear lesson that you can't have all these comics like this. It'd be interesting to see the numbers. What's happening right now in comic numbers, and I do a lot of analysis, is, the numbers are being kind of abstracted and guessed at. We're not getting solid shipping numbers. And the numbers that are being guessed at are, I would say, 20% higher than what we were seeing before. But I doubt those numbers. I think
there's always been comic books that have been printed and shipped out that weren't accounted for by Diamond.
Right.
Because, as a comic shop, you can go out and commission your own cover, print the damn comic, and there could be upwards of 30 or 40,000 more comics available if a shop went and paid for them to begin with. And those aren't really counted. I have a feeling that they're starting to put those into the main numbers. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it feels like a lot of stuff starting to blur in there. We do know a lot of comic shops in 2020 did do a lot more commissioning of titles to try and do something that made themselves stand apart from Midtown and other places. So I do think I think that we're just starting to, the math is not being counted the same way it used to be counted.
Yes.
And so now suddenly the numbers are a little bit higher in places, and that's in theory good news. And I think if we're counting comics that weren't counted before, I'm glad for it because we're more accurate today. But you can't draw a conclusion from that and say, hey, everything is doing much better. No, we were counting wrong before. I think that
it's when they say there's been enormous growth in the industry, and you're like, well, this year you started counting manga as comic books.
Yeah.
Well, this year you started counting, YA graphic novels as comic books. Well, this year you started counting Kickstarter and Indiegogo as comic books. Of course, there's growth because you're adding new revenue streams.
Exactly. And again, I think it's probably good that you're now counting all these other things. I do think that just throwing manga and YA and Scholastic and all this other stuff into the mix is, you need to classify it. You just can't have one big lump graphic novels. And I think very, very quickly, at some point this year, there's going to have to be accounting of how much of those sales are made up by manga. Because if manga's driving the kind of numbers they're driving right now, it's a very unhealthy look at the industry to say comic books are doing great when, more than 2/3 of it is manga. That's not helping anybody. So we're going to have to classify this stuff. But I'm glad we're getting more data out. It's just like you said. I think people are drawing this conclusion of everything is going amazing. It's like, well, you've changed.
It's like somebody that specializes in Western movies saying the movie industry is doing great. We're doing great. It's like, now superhero movies are doing great.
Yeah. Exactly.
Westerns aren't doing so well. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's funny math, and I don't think it helps anyone. I think it continues this narrative. There's almost a kind of an attitude with articles like this and stuff you see on social media at times around like, screw you people who are saying comic books have problems. Comic books are doing great. See, look, everything is doing great. It's like it's used as a defense mechanism as opposed to a real statement on the industry. And I love comics, and I do think some parts of comics are going great. But I don't want good news to hide problems, and that's what it feels like this stuff often is.
I agree that. So, if you were to sum up your thoughts on the way the comic book industry survived the pandemic shutdown, just in a sentence or two, do you have anything like
Yeah,
quippy you can put out there?
They just pushed things that were not new comics. They tried to circle the wagons and stabilize their business, and they tried to make sure that they had more types of content for people to buy, whether those are Marvel, DC, indies, graphic novels, back issues, manga, whatever it happens to be. That's the shops that did that effectively stayed alive and grew. Yeah,
shops and customers saved comic books. It wasn't the big two, in my opinion.
No, absolutely. I definitely think it was some shops that pushed themselves into doing more, customers for sure, and like I said, it is worth stating that DC pushing to come out helped, and it pushed the industry forward, and that was a positive. Like they did lots of other things goofy and wrong, but them pushing for a change helped.
Absolutely, and they definitely deserve recognition for that, and the industry should probably be thanking them right now, because there was a void, and comic books have been able to fill it to a point.
Yeah, that's right.